Syria. 66 years ago, French troops left and the state was born. Well, today, France is among those countries pushing for an end to a conflict that's claimed more than 11,000 Syrian lives in 13 months. Here in Paris, delegates from dozens of states have been asserting their commitment to pressure the regime of Bashar al-Assad. And the French Foreign Minister Alain Juppé claims progress has been made. He says international sanctions have halved the regime's revenue.
Based on our information, Syria's financial reserves have decreased by 50%, and we know that the Syrian authorities are actively seeking alternative routes to avoid sanctions. Some countries unambiguously support the Syrian regime. Others offer Syria alternative markets in a more or less direct way. We must respond to these moves.
Meanwhile, on the ground in Syria, the first UN blue helmets have arrived. These observers are here following a pledge from the regime in Damascus and the opposition to respect a ceasefire which was brokered by the UN envoy Kofi Annan. But after a brief lull last week, reports suggest that violence has resumed. Here is the latest amateur footage coming to us from the city of Homs. You can hear gunshot and shell attacks there. As always, though, we must point out we cannot confirm the authenticity of any footage that comes to us from Syria. So what now for the country? Well, joining me tonight to discuss, Vincent Floriani is a spokesperson for the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Also in the studio with me tonight is Ariel Colonomos. He's the Director of Research at CNRS. We're also joined on the line tonight by Kako Evin, a spokesperson for the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. She's on the line from London. In New York, Jeffrey Laurenti is a senior fellow at the Century Foundation. Good evening to you. And by satellite, also in New York, Philippe Bolopion, United Nations Director at Human Rights Watch. Thanks to you all indeed for being with us. Kako Evin, if I could start with you. UN observers are on the ground. What exactly are they supposed to be observing, given that there seems to be violence very much still going on?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, the Syrian government is breaching the ceasefire, and today, so far, we have 16 casualties. We have 9 people killed in Idlib. The dead body of 2 people in Homs were found today, and there were people who were been arrested 3 months ago in the city of Al-Qusayr. 3 people were killed today in Daraa, and the dead body of a person was handed to his family in suburbs of Damascus. He was killed under torture. So yes, the violence is still going, and the regime still treating the protesters and the people in Syria with brutality.
So what do you think then of the arrival of these blue helmets? We've got 6 there for the time being, another 250 due to arrive, depending on the outcome of a vote at the United Nations. What do you think about the whole mission?
Well, I mean, we're hoping that the international community will pressurize the regime to hold the ceasefire. I mean, the casualties numbers have dropped as if we compare it to before the ceasefire. Still, there are casualties, but we hope the mission will still succeed, because this is the last chance to solve this problem in Syria peacefully without dragging the country into a severe war and go the war way.
Now, it's not just the forces loyal to the regime who are reportedly breaching the ceasefire. It's also members of the opposition, some of whom have quite openly declared that they will be stockpiling weapons and they don't intend to hold fire at all.
Well, I mean, I think if we go the first day of breaching the ceasefire, it was the regime to blame. And from the start, we're getting more defectors. It's always the regime's fault, because the brutality of the regime and the continuation by pressurizing the peaceful uprising is leading to more defection. It's leading to more violence. So it's the regime who's responsible for the situation and how badly it gets. And they have to act and hold the ceasefire and start to work with the international community towards implementing the other point from Kofi Annan mission.
All right, Kako Evin, many thanks indeed for joining us. I'll turn to you, if I may, Ariel Colonomos. You wrote in Le Monde this morning that the Kofi Annan plan was too vague in the first place.
Yeah, well, actually, I wrote this piece last week, and yes, I mean, it would have been very surprising had Assad followed the rules that were set in the plan. I mean, I don't know anyone who would have made the claim that there was certainty or even hope that he would follow these rules. I mean, this plan gave him a certain advantage. I mean, he knew that he would not follow strictly those rules, and it was just a matter of winning time. So I think one of the flaws of this of the plan was not take into account what Assad would have done, which to a certain extent was foreseeable, and what kind of advantage this plan was giving to him. Right. And that's why I made the claim that it was more an exercise of procrastination. That is, the problems were there, and they're still here.
Vincent Floriani, of course, France, Britain, the United States have been among those, along with the Arab League now, who came into it later in the game. They are the ones really calling for some kind of action, some kind of intervention. But obviously at the UN, they were hampered by Russia and by China, who vetoed their attempts to intervene. Has the West backed kind of a half-baked plan in the absence of the plan that it actually wanted in the first place?
Well, we're trying to work with what we have. We have Kofi Annan, a man we trust, a man we think can achieve a lot of things. We have the plan, the 6 points plan. The first one, which should have been implemented, which is actually the second point of the plan, the ceasefire from the regime, the pulling out their troops, their heavy weapons on the 10th of February, that didn't succeed. But from the 12th of April, we had a decrease of the violence. I'm not calling that a ceasefire. What we are doing, we achieved this resolution, the 2042, that was adopted a few days back on Saturday. This is the first time we have a resolution agreed by everybody, including China and Russia, on supporting Kofi Annan. Now they are completely committed by this resolution. We had this meeting today in Paris by about 50 delegations to increase pressure on the regime, putting more sanctions, trying to make sure the sanctions are more coordinated, more implemented by many states. This is the way we are trying to work.
Right, and I do want to talk about the international sanctions in a moment, but let's stay with the Annan plan at the moment. Jeffrey Laurenti in New York. One of the criticisms levelled against this plan is that there was a lack of goodwill on either side, from the regime, from the opposition. Even the international community themselves, those pushing for intervention, have doubted its ability to work. What do you make of that?
Well, you first had so many doubts, particularly in the West, about whether Assad would go for any ceasefire at all, whether this was entirely a game. We've seen that the ceasefire part of the plan has been reasonably somewhat observed, with a marked diminution in the number of attacks and casualties. It appears that the Damascus government is willing to make some semblance of cooperation only as much as it has to in order to satisfy its major patrons, the Russians most of all, arguably the Chinese as well. And so its action appears to be simply a function of responding to the pressure from its own allies. And on the other side, you have some in the opposition who are determined just to overthrow this government and are not looking for a dialogue that shares power in the end. And so they have been chafing at the bit. And UN officials worry about the shipment of arms that supposedly is quietly underway from some of the Gulf states to those rebels.
And what about the charge that this is, to a certain extent, given Assad legitimacy because it's invited him into the process of negotiation? It's put him on the same playing field, as you will, as the rebels.
Assad, well, for the Western country, he may have lost his legitimacy by dint of the brutal acts of suppression of the protest and democracy movement in the opposition. But for a large number of countries, and particularly important, the Chinese and the Russians, he hasn't lost a shred of legitimacy as the government in power in Damascus that you have to deal with if you're going to try to get some kind of settlement that avoids Syria dropping into the abyss and completely unraveling. That is, dealing with him is presumably inevitable if you're going to try to find some compromise. Or the alternative, as Kofi Annan says, the alternative to his, there's no other game other than a knockdown, drag-out war, and that nobody can predict what the consequence of that kind of war would be.
All right, and let's before we go on, let's take a quick listen to Susan Rice. She's the US ambassador to the United Nations. Here's what she had to say about Bashar al-Assad last night.
Should the violence persist and the ceasefire or cessation of violence more aptly not hold, that, as we said as a council and as we said on a national basis on Saturday, will call into question the wisdom and the viability of sending in the full monitoring presence.
So it seems, Ariel, that the people are losing faith with this plan before it's really even got off the ground.
Yeah, I think there was an important point that was being made, is that we often talk about this plan as something that is the outcome of people who have the same values, the same interests, so they reach a collective decision. However, I mean, as it was clearly, this point was clearly made, I mean, there's a great divergence of interest. So the states do not agree around the table. Russia, China, France, the United States, they clearly have different interests, different values. The stakes are not the same. So what is the outcome? The outcome of the plan is reaching a consensus by default. That's why it is so vague. And that's why also, I mean, it's clearly...
in terms of you can't please everybody all the time. So
exactly.
You
so
end
then
up with
the consensus you reach is a consensus about something that is very vague, and that has to satisfy everyone.
And how would it be more specific? What would you have liked to see in that plan?
Well, one of the major issues that was a question that was being raised since the beginning was the survival of the Assad regime. And some people were making the claim that one condition was that the Assad regime should go. And of course, I mean, this was impossible given the people that were around the table. And of course, I mean, this plan, that's why I think it is procrastination. I mean, doesn't raise the issue of what you do if the plan fails. And the plan, I doubt that the plan is a success. So therefore, what do we do? And so we have those sets of questions. One of them is economic sanctions, of course. But economic sanctions, to me, is already passé. It's very difficult to have effective economic sanctions when these kind of financial targeted sanctions, when they do not come as a surprise. I mean, Assad is not naive. I mean, he has already anticipated that there would be at some point economic sanctions. I mean, it's good to take sanctions, but to what extent will they be effective?
He says that the sanctions have halved Syria's financial reserves, which were thought to be around $17 billion at the beginning of the uprising, and that it's costing him 400 million euros a month. How would you respond to the charge that the sanctions were already anticipated by al-Assad and so aren't really making much difference?
I mean, it's partly true. Some of the sanctions, like freezing assets, they can anticipate, because we try to keep the discussion on future sanctions discreet, but when they learn that we're about to freeze their assets, they may remove from the bank account the assets. But the sanctions on oil, you know, stopping buying Syrian oil.
Right, a third of their oil.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's really a lot, and it's really cutting the revenues of the regime. And we hope it will put more pressure, because the Syrian regime is buying people, and with less resources, they can no longer play that way.
All right, let's bring in Philippe Bellopion, the UN Director for Human Rights Watch. From your point of view, and from many people's point of view, stopping the violence was the imperative, wasn't it? But is there a risk, and Kofi Annan, it has to be said, is the only international envoy who has managed to get any kind of lull in the violence. Is there a risk, though, that it will resume and be worse than ever, that we're not really tackling the problem here?
Well, you know, it's you have to start somewhere, and from our point of view, of course, if the deployment of the UN mission of unarmed military observers can help reduce the violence and create the space for political dialogue, then it will be a good thing. But of course, these are unarmed UN observers, and their mission will only work if the government is sincere in its desire to stop the violence and start a dialogue with the opposition. What we are a bit worried about is that people are looking at the conflict right now in just one dimension, and it's whether the ceasefire is holding. And of course, the Annan plan is much more than that, because even if the tanks get out of the cities, even if the Syrians stop pounding homes or other cities with mortars, the human rights crisis and the crackdown on dissent can still be very much alive. And one of the key parts, for example, of the Annan plan is that the government should have already released all the people it has arbitrarily detained over the last few months. And we are talking about thousands of people, many of them who have been tortured, some of them who are children and women. And we hope that the military observers that are to be deployed in Syria will also be able to look into these kind of situations.
But there is a risk, isn't there, that the observers are going in blind, if you like. They won't be able to see what's going on because they will be manipulated by the Assad regime. They'll be seeing what the regime wants them to see, much as we saw with the Arab League observers mission earlier this year.
Well, look, the risk is very real. I think the UN is very aware that it's a high-risk mission. In fact, Kofi Annan himself and Jean-Marie Guéhenno, who is his deputy, both have headed the Department of Peacekeeping Operations at the UN. So they know how the game can be played. I think they know perfectly well that there is a risk that the Syrian regime will start a game of cat and mouse with the UN observers. The fact that the UN observers will have no security of their own in a situation that is still very volatile, I find raises all kinds of red flags. But there is no really plan B there. So I think they are willing to take a chance, willing to try it. And we are, with many other organizations, we are going to do our best from the outside to monitor the situation as best as we can, to flag any situation that we believe should be on the radar of the UN observers.
And just a final point, just briefly, we're hearing that Russia will be substantially represented in that mission. That's according to the Deputy Foreign Minister. A little worrying there?
Well, look, it's not surprising, and it's not surprising that the Syrian government will want to make sure that the UN observers are not only coming from Western countries or countries that they see as hostile. As long as the Russian nationals are from the UN, are representing the interests of the UN, there is no reason to exclude them from a mission like this one. Of course, what I would say is that what we need from the Russian government is, of course, to stop selling weapons to the Assad regime, because there is a chance that these weapons will be used to commit human rights violations. And they also need to back up the plan and to make clear to the Syrian regime that if the government does not respect its end of the deal, there will be serious consequences in the Security Council, including targeted sanctions.
Philip, sorry to cut you off. We're going to have to take a short break. When we come back, we'll talk more about the Russian position and the rest of the elements having an impact on the situation in Syria. Stay tuned.